Hello and welcome back to my Getting Started with C course. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at a thing called functions, which are a way of basically simplifying our code and splitting it up into more manageable pieces. So, as usual, to get started, we're going to create a new file in our editor of choice, and let's just call this one, I'm going to call it functions.c because that's what we're doing, okay? And inside this main file, we're just going to set up a standard C program. So we're going to have an int main, and let me make this text bigger as usual. An int main, and we won't take any arguments. So we will say void and open it and return -1. Okay, 0, my bad. Okay, so just a standard C program template to get started with. Now, first of all, we need an example for why we might need to use a function. So let's consider this situation. Say we have an array, and if you haven't seen my episode on arrays and want to sort of jog your memory about how arrays work, you can go back and check that out. But let's create an array called numbers, so a set of numbers. Let's just have 5 numbers, and we can initialize it. Let's just be basic and initialize it to 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, perfect. All right, and say we want to find the biggest number in this array. Now, obviously, as the programmer, we can look at this array and say, well, 5 is obviously the biggest number stored in there. But in this hypothetical, let's assume we don't know what's stored in the array. How can we find the biggest number in the array? Well, that's really simple. Obviously, we would use a for loop. So we'd say for int I equals 0, I less than, and there are 5 elements in our array. So we're going to say less than 5, I plus plus. And what this will do is it will loop 5 times, increasing I each time. And then we can simply access what our number is. So int current number equals numbers I. Okay, so if you don't know what's going on here, basically you'll have to sort of look at my episode on loops and also my episode on arrays. But essentially all we're doing is we are looping through the array and looking at every single number stored in it and storing that temporarily in a variable called current number. Okay, so now outside of our array, let's create a variable called max. Okay, and we're going to start that off as 0. Now, all we need to do is if the current number greater than or equals, let's say, well, let's just say greater than. If our current number is greater than the max number, then our max number is equal to our current number. Okay, so basically we loop through our array and look at every number, and if the number we find is bigger than our previous value that we'd stored in maximum, then we set the maximum to this new bigger number that we found. Okay, and if we do a printf on this, so let's just say max number is, and do our %d because it's an integer that we're trying to print, and put in max here, what we should see when we compile and run this is that we will get 5 printed out because that's the biggest number in this set. Okay, so if we compile this using our normal commands, oh, we've got a warning here. What's going on here? My bad. You cannot use printf if you don't include #include the standard input-output library. Okay, with that fixed, if we now compile and run our code, okay, and well, we've got to run it, you'll see that the max number is 5, which indeed it is. And of course, we can change these numbers to anything we want. If we make this 31 and come back down and recompile and then rerun our code, you'll see that what we get is, oh my gosh, if I can find the main command, well, let me just type it out again. You'll see that we now find that the max number is 31. Okay, so this is pretty simple. This is just how we can find the maximum number in there. Okay, but what does that got to do with the main focus of what this episode is supposed to be talking about, which is functions? Well, let's say we have another set of numbers. Okay, and let's just call this numbers2, our second set of numbers. And in this one, let's maybe have a different set of numbers. Okay, so maybe -11, and here maybe we say 23. Okay. What if we also now want to find the maximum in this array? Well, that should be pretty easy, right? We can just copy this code and come down here and let me move this out of the way for you and paste it in. Okay, and then we've just got to remember, okay, we need to change this to numbers2, and this would be max2, and then we could copy this print statement and duplicate it, and then max number 2 is, and then here we just change this to max2. And then we would compile our code, what to keep track of, and run it. And yeah, we'd get 31 and 0. Now, what's going on there? Well, that's because there's a bug. We forgot to change this to max2 when we were changing everything over. So we'd have to make sure we remembered that, and we'd have to then recompile it again, and then we could test if it works. Maybe if I could learn how to use my computer. And okay, now that's not working. And as you can see, it's very messy. Okay, and there is more than one bug here. I mean, feel free to go through and see if you can spot them all, okay? But copying and pasting code, sometimes it's good, but sometimes it means we need to use a function, because when you copy and paste the code, it's really easy to miss different things and make a mess of your project, okay? So considering that we need to basically do the same code, anytime that you see the exact same code just being run on two different things, it's probably a good idea to use a function. So how do we do that? Well, I'm just going to start by nuking this second bit of code that we've copied in here. We don't need that anymore. Okay, well, firstly, we've actually already seen an example of a function, and that's the main function itself, okay? And we've already had a look at sort of how that works, which is we're saying that basically the main function here will return an integer when it's finished running, which is this return 0. And in some cases, we're going to take no arguments, which is void, means nothing, emptiness. But in other cases, we've seen, like, let me see if there's an example over here. Yeah. In other cases, we've seen that we might take some different arguments into our function, okay, which we can then use as variables inside. So how do we do that for our own? Well, first, we need to decide what our function is going to look like, okay? So here's what we're trying to put inside a function. And ultimately, what we're trying to get out at the end is the maximum number, okay? So the thing that we're going to return, or the thing that the function is going to give us back, is going to be a number which represents the maximum number found in an array, okay? So that means that we know that the function is going to return an integer, okay? So we start with the int keyword saying, hey, our function is going to give us back an int as a result. Then we need to name our function, okay? So let's call it find max, because we're trying to find the maximum value. And then we need to tell our function, hey, you're going to take in this information. These arguments is what we call it. So here, for example, printf, we are passing it a string and a variable here as our arguments. Say, hey, take this information and use it to do whatever you need to do, okay? Now for us, we're going to want to look through an int array. So we're going to need to get access to the int array inside our function. So to do that, it's sort of similar. We say we're going to take in an int array, and we're going to call it, say, I don't know, we can call it array. You can call it whatever you want. This is just for us to use later, you'll see. And we just need to say that it is an array, okay? Because remember, if I just said this, then our function find max would take a single integer. So we want to say, hey, it's an array of some length, okay? The next thing we're going to want to need, and you'll see why in a moment, is the length of our array. So we're going to take in another integer called array size, okay? And then we do our open and close brackets. So just like how our main function here is wrapped by these open and closed squiggly brackets, any function that we define must also be inside these open and closed squiggly brackets, because that defines a block of code. Okay, so now what do we do? Well, we can just copy this code out of here. So Control X to cut and Control V to paste. That's Command on Mac. Okay, and it's mostly already working. There's a few things that we need to do. First of all, in our original loop, we loop through until I is equal to 5, because there is 5 numbers in our array. But to make this more general, we should just loop until the specified array size. That way we can give someone an array that's a different size and this function can still handle it. So we're going to make our for loop while I is less than array size. Okay, and so now this will just loop until we hit the size of the array that is passed into our function. And numbers here, if we hover over it, it'll say that the identifier numbers is unidentified, or undefined, my bad. And that's because it doesn't know what this variable references, okay? And this is a key piece of information to remember. Variables that are declared between brackets are only accessible within those brackets. So this numbers variable is declared in this set of brackets here. So we cannot access it in this set of brackets. Okay, but that's why we have taken in this integer array as an argument to our function. So if we come back and put in array and save, now this is more or less working. There's one thing we're missing. If you remember that our main returns an int, well, that matches up with this return keyword. Right now, if we were to compile our code, we'd actually get a warning because we don't have a return statement for this function. So because we're trying to find the maximum value, then we should return it once we found it. So we're just going to say return max. Because after this loop is finished, the value that will be stored in max will be the largest that was in the array. So we're going to return it. Okay, so that's first thing done. The next thing we're going to do is come up here, and now we can use our function. So we're going to say int max is going to be equal to the result of calling our find max function and passing it in our numbers array, as well as the size of our numbers array. Now remember, our numbers array is 5 elements, so the array size variable is going to be 5. And what I want you to understand is, these bits here correspond directly to the argument list we defined in our function definition. Okay, so the int array here, the variable called array that we use inside of our function, is going to be set equal to numbers, because that's in position 1. And then our single integer array size, which we use for our looping, is going to be set equal to 5. All right, so we go array and then array size, and here we pass in an array and an array size. And these data types have to match. This is an integer, so our array size is an integer, and this is an integer array, so we pass in an integer array, which is this numbers array. Okay. Then finally, when we return a value, basically it means that this function will be evaluated and replaced by whatever we return. Okay, so this function gets called, it runs, and then this here will get replaced with the result of the function, which is what this return statement means. And we're just going to store that in a variable called max. Now, there is actually still a problem with our code here, and let's see what happens when we try and compile it. So if I bring up my terminal again, and we try to compile functions.c, or whatever you might have called it, I don't know if you've called it something different, and we're going to put it in main.exe, or just main if you're on Linux or Apple. If we hit enter, we're going to get this warning. Okay, it says warning, implicit declaration of function find max. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it's pretty simple. When our program is running, it compiles from top down to bottom. Okay, so the compiler starts reading at the top line and then it goes down the file. By the time we reach line 8, it says that we are calling a function called find max. However, it hasn't reached the part where we defined find max yet, so it doesn't know that it exists. And that's why we get a warning. Now, technically, it's smart enough to try and work around this, and that's why it's not an error, but still, it doesn't really know what this is because it hasn't seen it yet. So we have two options. The first option is to copy and paste our function declaration instead above, so that way it reads this function first. Then by the time it sees our calling of the function, it knows what it is. And if you save this and compile it, it will understand what this is. No errors, okay? That's one option. Your other option is, if we put this back where it was, is to simply do something called a function declaration, okay? So what we can simply say at the very top of our file is we can let the compiler know. Say, hey compiler, I've got a function that returns an integer. It's called find max, and it takes an array of ints and an int as an argument, okay? So this looks a bit weird, but this is called a function declaration. It's basically just telling the compiler, hey, I have this function. It exists, so when I try and use it, don't throw an error, okay? It does exist, it's just further down in the file. And this literally just represents a function that returns an integer, is called find max, takes an integer array, like ours does, and takes an int. Note that you don't have to include the variable names in your function declaration. You just need the data types and the function name itself. All right, so if you compile that, it will also work. And now running our code, you'll see that our max number is 31, which is correct because we are finding the max in the numbers array, which is this, and we're just giving it the array size. And it's important that you make sure you give it the right element, the right number of elements. If we made this 1, okay, if we said, hey, find the maximum number in this numbers array, but the array size is only 1, well, it's pretty obvious what will happen, but it'll only just find the first element, okay? Because as far as it's aware, then this is the only thing that's stored in the array. So you need to make sure that the array size that you pass it matches up. Okay, so that's sort of an example, an applied example of why we might use a function, okay? Because now we can also do int max2 and set that equal to the find max of our numbers2 array, and that also has 5 elements in it, okay? And we could print this out and this works fine. We don't have to repeat our code a bunch of times. We just have to repeat the function call and it keeps things a lot simpler. All right, so that's the brief breakdown. You can take that and run with it if you're happy with it. And I'll go on to give one more example of a different kind of function we can do. Okay, so what if we want a function that doesn't necessarily return a value? Okay, because our functions don't have to return a value and they don't have to take arguments. And how do we do this? Well, let's make a function for printing out what the max number is, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to use the void keyword, okay? And void means, hey, our function will not return any value whatsoever. Okay, and we're going to say void, we'll call this one print max, and it's just going to take an integer called number, okay, for example, and opening and closing it. And then inside this, we're just going to copy, we're going to copy our print line, and we're going to change this to number. Okay, so now what we have is a function that returns nothing, so we can't get a value out of it, but the code inside it will still run. We just don't get a value back at the end, so we don't need a return statement. Okay, it's called print max. It takes a number, and then once we give it the number, it just simply prints the number using printf. Okay, so this code will run, but it won't return a value. So what we can do down here is now our print statement has been, we can replace it with print max. And actually we should include a new line character at the end of our print statement so things don't get muddy. We can call print max and we can say we want to print the first maximum. And then we can call print max again and we can print the max2 value. And as you can see, this is essentially a way of simplifying our code. So now instead of needing to copy and paste the print statement twice, we can just use our own user-defined function that just takes a single integer, again, that's our argument, and then just prints it to the screen after saying max number is. Now again, one thing we do need to do is make sure we declare this function before we use it. So I'm just going to copy this line here and paste it in. Okay, and now we've declared that we have a function that returns nothing. It's a void function called printmax that takes an integer. And remember, in these simple declarations, you don't have to include the variable name, but you can if you want. The main important bit is the data type. Okay, so last but not least, if we come down, clear the terminal once again, and we run it, we compile it, we see no errors, and running it, we see that the max number is 31 and the max number is 23. And that corresponds to using our find max on our first array, which our biggest number is 31, and our find max on our numbers2 array, which our biggest number is 23. Printing them using our own custom void function called printmax. So thank you for watching. In the next episode, we're going to go over something called a struct, which is a way of keeping all sorts of related data together. Hope to see you there. All right, peace.